The Book of Samuel, the meeting between Samuel and the tribal elders, Episode 22. Hello to all listeners of the series dedicated to the great heroes described in the Book of Samuel. In the previous episode, we discussed how the book opens with a description of Samuel's childhood years, which were spent in a small worship center located in a settlement called Shiloh. This center housed the Ark of the Covenant that Moses had received at Mount Sinai, and so the Israelites came there to perform religious ceremonies in honor of God. Then, in a startling twist, the book abruptly pivots to an entirely different subject, seemingly disconnected from all that came before. From chapter 4 onwards, the war against a foreign people called the Philistines erupts onto the center stage of the book. This war drives all the events and actions of the heroes described in the book of Samuel. The war described in chapter 4, which we discussed in the previous episode, ended with the destruction of Shiloh and its temple and the capture of the Holy Ark. Eventually, the Ark was returned to Israel, but since the Philistines had destroyed Shiloh, Samuel moved to live in a settlement called Ramah, where his family resided. From then on, he became a wandering priest in the sense that he was the one who traveled from settlement to perform the services in honor of God, as described in chapters 7 and 9. Because the war with the Philistines is the backdrop for all of the stories and events recounted in the book of Samuel, we must add a few more details about these fascinating and brave people, who around 1300 BCE entered the historical stage and forever changed the face of Israelite society, as well as that of all the nations of the ancient Near East. The name Philistines is a collective name for several tribes originating from the area of Greece, Crete, and Turkey. For a reason that is still considered a historical mystery, they left their homelands and began to wander far in hopes of finding a new place to settle. The Philistines did not migrate as a cohesive body, but rather they spread across the countries of the ancient Near East. One of those groups arrived in the land of Israel around 1200 BCE, which is more than 100, perhaps 150 years before Samuel's time. Since the Philistines were experienced seafarers with a long tradition of maritime trade, they initially settled in the coastal cities of Israel, which they developed and turned into thriving trading cities. Yet in the years to come, as we learn from the book of Samuel and from the abundance of archaeological findings they left behind, the Philistines began to invade inland. This movement indicates that they had gradually become an agricultural society, and the farmers needed farmland and water sources. To achieve their goal, the Philistines, who until now had lived in peace with the Israelites, gradually began attacking the Israelite settlements, with the intention of driving them from their homes and lands. This war between the two nations reached its peak in the days of Samuel, and this is the reason the Bible turns to talk about them. Now we must explain the special warfare method that characterized the way the Philistines attacked Israelite settlements. The Philistines established 5 central cities in Israel, along with small villages. The central cities were organized as military strongholds, each headed by a commander, who in English translations is called a lord of the Philistines. The commanders, or the lords, made sure to preserve the military knowledge that they had acquired in their countries of origin and pass it on to the next generations. They also built walls around their central cities. Although each of the Philistine cities operated independently, in times of war the city commanders cooperated. From the book of Samuel, we learn that the Philistines used to concentrate forces around the village they wanted to attack, and then they pounced on it from all sides with a mighty force, destroying and looting it, or driving out its inhabitants and settling in their place. Another detail that will prove important in the following episodes refers to the fact that the Philistines, who engaged in maritime trade, brought iron ore to Israel in their ships, along with the technological knowledge required for iron forge. The Philistines made spears and javelins made of iron, which gave them a significant military advantage over the Israelites. And since they understood that the knowledge of iron production was a strategic asset, they jealously guarded this knowledge and prevented its spread. The book of Samuel provides 2 fascinating bits of evidence for the fact that while the Israelites were still using wooden weapons, the Philistines already had iron weapons. The first one refers to the days of Saul and his son Jonathan, whom we will discuss in one of the upcoming episodes. In short, it is said in chapter 13, "Not a blacksmith could be found in the whole land of Israel, because the Philistines had said, 'Otherwise the Hebrews will make swords or spears.' So, on the day of the battle, not a soldier with Saul and Jonathan had a sword or spear in his hand. Only Saul and his son Jonathan had them." The second example refers to the famous battle between David and Goliath, the Philistine giant, from the city of Gat, which was one of those military cities. While David used a sling, which was a shepherd's weapon used to drive away wolves, Goliath was equipped with iron weapons and a helmet and armor made of copper. When we get to the story of the battle between the two, we will tell how the heavy armament that Goliath equipped himself with led to his downfall. The book of Samuel does not hide the fact that the Israelites suffered repeated defeats at the hands of the Philistines. This was largely due to their adherence to the traditional tribal structure, which proved disadvantageous in times of war. And this must be explained. The greatest weakness of the tribes of Israel was that each tribe lived and acted for itself. In times of war, it fought only to save its own territory on which it lived. Except for 2, maybe 3 cases, even in times of war, the tribes hardly cooperated. Each tribe could cope and even win against an enemy of its size, but against a stronger and more skilled enemy, it had no chance of survival. This was true throughout the ancient world, in medieval Europe, and in Israel in Samuel's time. The lords of the Philistines, who united their military forces in times of war, exploited this fact to their advantage. Furthermore, while experienced warriors stood at the head of Philistine society, at the head of Israelite society stood the tribal elders, whose main role was civil, not military. These elders settled internal disputes, served as judges, etc. And while the Philistine commanders cooperated in times of war, the tribal elders hardly cooperated, even in times of war. The elders were very wise men and understood the weaknesses we mentioned. They understood that if they wanted to live, they had to unite and appoint a warrior king at their head who would establish a skilled army that could deal with the Philistines. Therefore, one day they came to Samuel's house and told him that that was their wish. Chapter 8 opens briefly with these words. When Samuel grew old, he appointed his sons as Israel's leaders. But his sons did not follow his ways. They turned aside after dishonest gain and accepted bribes and perverted justice. This quote unequivocally states that Samuel's sons were not much better than the rebellious sons of Eli, the old priest, who were described in chapters 2 and 3. Yet, despite Samuel's knowledge of this, he used his power and status and prepared them to inherit his position, something that the elders strongly opposed. Quote, "You are old, and your sons do not follow your ways. Now appoint a king to lead us, such as all the other nations have." The criticism voiced by the elders against him and his sons, together with the request to choose a king from among them, angered Samuel. Perhaps because he could not contradict their words, he refused their request to appoint a king, but the elders stood their ground and said to him, "No," they said, "we want a king over us. Then we will be like all the other nations, with a king to lead us and to go out before us and fight our battles." It should be noted that while the elders referred to the need to find a military solution to the war against the Philistines, Samuel justified his opposition by saying that their request was a rebellion against God, the only king of Israel. And indeed, Samuel prayed to God, and this, according to the text, was the answer he received. "And the Lord told him, 'Listen to all that the people are saying to you. It is not you they have rejected, but they have rejected me as their king. Now listen to them, but warn them solemnly, and let them know what the king who will reign over them will claim as his rights.'" God's answer, seeing the elders' request as a betrayal of him, is problematic. It does not align with the fact that the elders believed in him with all their hearts, nor does it align with the fact that God instructed Samuel to grant their request. As commanded, Samuel delivered a long speech to the elders. This speech was intended to prove to them that their demand was a big mistake, but in practice, his words justified them. Let's quote a few sentences from the speech. This is what the king who will reign over you will claim as his rights. He will take your sons and make them serve with his chariots and horses, and they will run in front of his chariots. Some he will assign to be commanders of thousands and commanders of 50s. He will take 1/10 of your grain and of your vintage and give it to his officials and attendants. He will take 1/10 of your flocks, and you yourselves will become his slaves. And Samuel concluded his words with these words: When that day comes, you will cry out for relief from the king you have chosen, but the Lord will not answer you in that day. The speech Samuel gave describes a tyrannical king who imposes heavy taxes that exploit his people, a king who cares only for himself and his associates. And indeed, countless examples can be brought of kings who brought destruction and ruin upon their people and their country. But the opposite is also true. The history of Egypt, Babylon, Persia, Greece, and China, along with countless other kingdoms, teaches about kings who brought prosperity to their kingdoms in all areas of life. These kings collected taxes from their people so that they could finance a trained army to protect the borders of their kingdoms and to build fortified walls to protect the central cities. In other words, the fact that kings always cared for their own good and that of their associates does not contradict the fact that kings who did not take taxes that allowed them to act for the good of their kingdoms weakened their kingdoms, and their enemies took advantage of this and conquered them. And these things bring us back to the day when the tribal elders stood in Samuel's house and defined in his ears what kind of king they wanted. Quote, "A king to lead us and to go out before us and fight our battles." The elders asked for a warrior king, like all of the kings throughout the ancient world. They wanted a king who would command their army and would lead the warriors into battle. The elders asked for a king like that of the Philistine lords, those who managed to defeat the tribes of Israel time and again. Samuel knew very well that the Philistines had conquered and destroyed many villages in Israel. He knew that tribal society would not be able to survive the Philistine pressure unless this society underwent a drastic change, a change that would create a warrior king who would go out at the head of the army to fight against the Philistines. Even though Samuel vehemently opposed the request of the elders, and the question of what explains his objection brings us back to what the elders had said. "You are old, and your sons do not follow your ways. Now appoint a king to lead us, such as all the other nations have." These words insulted Samuel, but because God had instructed him to fulfill the elders' request, Samuel, as revenge, chose the least suitable person for kingship. He chose a young man who lacked both military experience and self-confidence, a man whom he had tormented in front of everyone. The young king was Saul, and in the following episodes we will see that Samuel terrorized him and was the man who brought about his downfall. Before we part, we must explain the difficult things we have said about Samuel's behavior. From a distance of thousands of years, many of us regard the heroes of the Bible as exemplary figures. However, the Bible does not relate them as supreme heroes, but as real people who had virtues and weaknesses like any other person, and this is the great secret of the biblical stories. Despite the distance of years and the cultural and legal gap, something in these stories seems to be talking about us. We have seen this in the previous episodes when we talked about Sarah, who was furious at Hagar, who had humiliated her because of her barrenness. And what woman wouldn't be angry at such wickedness? We saw this when we talked about Rachel's love for her son Jacob, whom she preferred over her second son. And who among us doesn't know parents who for some reason prefer one child over the other? In the series dedicated to the book of Ruth, we talked about the delicate love relationship between the elderly Naomi and Ruth, her daughter-in-law. This love was revealed precisely in times of distress. And who among us doesn't know people whose good heart is revealed precisely in times of distress? And who among us has not encountered generous people like Boaz, who spread his protection over the two poor women who were each other's whole world? Thanks to the simple honesty with which the Bible describes the character of whom it talks, we can find in each of them something true, emotional, and powerful, which is found in each one of us. Even after so many years, we can still identify with the biblical characters. There is a mysterious element we cannot define, not always flattering, but always truthful. This holds for Samuel as well. The entire spectrum of human emotions is awaiting us in the following episodes dedicated to the days of Saul's reign. That's all for now. Thank you very much, and please tell relatives and friends about this special podcast.